Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zalzer back with another episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. Today, we're here with Nanako Tamaru for season 12, episode 16. Hard to believe we're already at 16 for this season, talking about where inclusion meets resistance, lessons from a career in global peace and security. For people who have not joined us in the past, the live stream of the Social Change Career Podcast generally goes about an hour. And we really deeply enjoy when we get input and feedback and participation from whoever's watching, particularly on LinkedIn and or YouTube. So throughout the entire session, feel free to put a little bit about who you are, where you're watching from, some bullet points about your interests, and then also your questions, comments, and resources. And as much as possible, the more interactive, the better. And then once this podcast is done, the recording will be on YouTube and LinkedIn. And then in about 10 days, it'll be up as one of almost 150 episodes of the Social Change Career Podcast, which you can find on PCDN Global or any major podcasting platform. And 2-3 quick requests. First, please follow Nanako on LinkedIn. She does amazing work. Follow BNID, follow PCDN, and then please consider rating and sharing the podcast to help grow our reach. And if you go to PCN Global/listen, you can check out, as I said, the other 150 episodes with brilliant innovators from all parts of the world working on innovative finance and peacekeeping and humanitarian relief and tech for social change, reducing gender-based violence. And you can search by topic. And really, I think we have people from 30 countries, from foundation heads to grassroots activists. So that's the logistics. Nanako, we'll summarize her bio. She's a licensed attorney and peace and security practitioner. She's an independent consultant, adjunct faculty at Brandeis, and also the director of the Boston Network for International Development. She advises and supports civil society governments and international organizations with social inclusion, gender equity initiatives, community-driven peace-building programs, and inclusive approaches to state building. She's also a global expert on women's leadership and constitutional reform. She's managed peace-building programs in Syria and Somalia and has written on issues related to governance and conflict resolution for UN Women, UNDP, Mercy Corps, International IDEA, and Harvard University. So that is a quick summary. I mean, obviously, she has an amazing range of experience and wisdom. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. Nanako is in Vermont. So prior to starting, we were talking about sharing a love of skiing. So we'll jump in right now. So Nanako, how in the world, if you think back to when you were a teenager, not that you had to have any idea of what you wanted to do in the world, but did you always envision yourself working at this intersection of peace, rights, and security? Or did you aspire to lots of different careers? And how did you find this one?
It's a great question. Thank you so much, Craig, for having me on your podcast today. It's just such a thrill and honor to be here with you and everyone joining virtually. When I was a teenager, I actually wanted to be a doctor. I'm a child of immigrants. Well, my mother's an immigrant. My dad is from Hawaii, which I feel like is a different country all on its own. And so obviously my aspirations were to be, it was like a doctor, an engineer, something along those lines. So growing up, I really wanted to be a doctor. Did not even know that this was a career possibility. But it's been an interesting path. I definitely, if you would have asked me, when I was 16, even when I was 20, I never would have thought that I would have had the career that I do now. Maybe I can say a little bit about how I discovered this field of peace and security as a career. And I would say that, I grew up in a suburban, predominantly white community just outside of Seattle, Washington. I remember I looked up once the demographics, and it was 95% white, 2% African-American, 2% Latinx, and then 1% other. So I was definitely in just this other category already not being seen. And growing up, I experienced and witnessed a lot of implicit and explicit racism, but I never knew how to talk about it or how to name it. My parents never wanted to talk about it. There was really no one else that I could share my experience with. But I just felt really frustrated. Like I knew that it wasn't fair, and I was frustrated by these feelings. And it wasn't until actually in high school, I took a class on the U.S. Civil Rights Movement that things started to kind of click. Like, this is a thing, right? I'm not having the same exact experience as like the Jim Crow South, but I'm seeing some of these themes, and realizing that at that time that the civil rights movement really hadn't happened that much that long ago was really eye-opening to me. And from there, really kind of learning about Martin Luther King and the movement that he led started to make me think, where else is this happening? And I remember when I was in high school, the apartheid in South Africa had just ended a few years previous. And I thought the civil rights movement was not that far away. Like apartheid had just ended. And I was like, oh my God, like this is still happening in the world. This is crazy. And so from there, again, I still wanted to be a doctor, but I started kind of this little thing in the back of my head, being interested in this idea of kind of racial injustice, racial inequity, and society's kind of struggling with that, and seeing kind of my own experience kind of being wrapped up in that. And I ended up going to college. I went to UC Berkeley, intending to be a doctor, but discovered social sciences and was like, oh my God, this is a thing. People study this. Like this is a thing that you can learn. And that really kind of opened, like college was a place that really opened my eyes. But a funny story is that there is an amazing department and program at UC Berkeley called Peace and Conflict Studies. And I took, it was Peace and Conflict 101. And I was like, this is amazing. I love this. And I went to my academic advisor's office and, I was like, okay, I came in pre-med. I think I like peace and conflict studies. Like, what should I do? I'm this kid, my parents aren't giving me any guidance. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And my academic advisor said to me, I will never forget this. Don't major in peace and conflict studies. There's no job for you. There are no jobs for people with that major. Like, don't do it. Like, do poli-sci, do political science. That's a safer bet. You'll be able to find a job. And I was like, you must know things. I'll do that. And so I went into poli-sci and I studied at that time, we called it democratization or transitions to democracy. And in a way, kind of transitions to democracy towards peace. But it wasn't exactly peace and conflict studies. And again, I kind of left that behind until many years later. I then discovered, I actually went to grad school, not doing peace and conflict studies, but doing women's human rights advocacy. Discovered in grad school that peace and conflict or peace and security is an actual field that you can have a job in, and ended up where I am today. So it's like a very long journey of twists and turns and kind of figuring things out. But it all started out, I can honestly say, with that one class in high school about that civil rights movement. Thank you, Mr. Perry, who taught that class, that really kind of sparked that interest that it has carried on to today.
Have you ever told Mr. Perry about the impact that
I
class
haven't. I should. I really should.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking it's a little bit similar path. So my brother is a little bit older. He brought home a piece that I was always interested in business and social change. And obviously I'm probably a little older. I was worried about nuclear Armageddon. And I remember he brought home a really early peace study, just like this almost handmade, let's say, book that a professor made. And I was like, this is really cool. And, it was like, and I started off political science and UMass is like the Berkeley of the East. So we spent tons of times protesting and occupying buildings and stuff like that.
Yes, of course.
So I won't get into what we were protesting over. I never got arrested. Lots of my friends did. But we did take over the administration building. But like, the same thing. I started political science. I'm like, this is so boring. Not that political science is boring. I'm not trying to, and eventually wound up in a radical hippie major where we looked at anyway. So, but it's like, sounds like I never wanted to be a doctor, but so can you talk a little bit, like in terms of post Berkeley and whether before grad school or post grad school, kind of how you landed your first few jobs or fellowships, and how did you go from Berkeley to work in women's human right advocacy? And because I would say, like, what your advisor said in undergrad, like I've done a lot of research on careers, and obviously there, let's say 20, 30 years ago, there weren't that many jobs in peace. I mean, security, there's a lot of jobs if you want hard security, but now there's a lot more jobs, but there's still the supply side of people who want to work versus the demand side is still a huge gap. So how did you like find the right path to your first few paid employments?
That is a good question, and something that, looking back, I really had no idea what I was doing. My parents, my mom was an accountant. My dad was a systems analyst at Boeing. They really didn't know much in terms of how to help guide me into how to find a job. Again, like both coming from not only different sectors, but just like a very different background. You know, my mom emigrated here from Japan. You know, it just was very hard, I think, for me. And I got to say, actually, from the 5-6 years between undergrad and graduate programs, I worked in retail. I worked at department stores. I worked at an outdoor gear company. I was an admin assistant. I was a secretary because I applied for so many jobs. I knew that one way to get into the sector was to travel, so that you could, if you go live in another country, you can get some really great experience and then launch that into a career. I didn't even know, like, how do you get there? And like, just to even fly to some of these places, it's like $1,000 that I don't have, much less finding a job. And it just felt so out of reach. And I applied to so many jobs and I didn't know why I wasn't getting them. And just didn't have any guidance and like didn't know how to get in. And I think I just kind of got lucky, lucky in a way that one of my applications finally stuck. I mean, so at UC Berkeley, I studied political science and gender studies. Had done a lot of women's rights and sexual and gender-based violence advocacy as an undergrad. And so I eventually was able to land a job at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is now really well known for all of their domestic advocacy and litigation on reproductive rights here in the United States. But they also do work abroad in terms of advocacy, both around laws and policies and things like that, around maternal health as well. But again, there, I was an admin assistant. It wasn't a sexy position. It was a lot of, sending emails, taking meeting notes, getting lunch orders. But I felt like that was where I kind of got my foot in the door to be able to kind of launch into my graduate degree, because I really did at that time really wanted to work in women's human rights, specifically in reproductive rights. And so that I don't know how I got the job. I think I just honestly got lucky that they found my application materials interesting. And from there, I was able to then went to grad school. I went to the Fletcher School at Tufts, and law school at Boston University, with the intention of becoming like a litigator or advocate for women's human rights. But while I was at Fletcher, I discovered that there is a thing called peace and security. And when I was in undergrad, I studied poli-sci and I studied democratization. So it was a lot about governance, electoral systems, and things like that. And I got my first internship while I was in grad school at an organization called Conflict Dynamics International, where they do governance work. They really are exploring how can we think about governance systems to support long-term peace. So if you think about a particular country who's going through a conflict, would a presidential or a parliamentary system be better to sustain peace in the long run? What kind of electoral system will help to make sure that everyone's voices are being heard? How can we include things like traditional and customary entities, whether that's tribal leaders or religious leaders, into governance? Again, recognizing that different cultures and different societies will have different ways of doing things related to governance and laws and policies. And that internship was transformational, right? Going to Fletcher and learning that it was a possibility, and then finding this internship where I was like, you actually do this every day as your job. Like, I studied this 6-7 years ago and thought it was just kind of, that was it. That was the end of my academic study. And now it was time to move on to something else. And so to discover that there was an organization out there doing this amazing work, seeing how it connected to promoting peace and stability in many of these places that are undergoing these terrible conflicts, sometimes generational conflicts, was just so eye-opening. And I would say my work at Conflict Dynamics really kind of kicked off kind of my career to where it is now. And if you look at my LinkedIn, you look at my resume, that's kind of where you don't see me working at Macy's, me working at as a secretary and all these other positions that I had. Like, if you look at my degrees, if you look at my career starting with that internship, you would say, oh, Nanako had it figured out. This is what she always knew she wanted to do. Look at all these jobs. They line so nicely, but it's the behind the scenes story is so much more messy and complex, but I am happy that I got to where I am, and that I found a field that I feel passionate about, and that I do enjoy working in, and working with just some of the world's most amazing people. But I feel like it was quite a journey to actually get here and discover that this is something that you can do as for a living, as part of your job, and have that fulfillment as well.
I actually applied to Fletcher. I think I already had a master's. I did my master at Central European University. I think I applied to Fletcher and SAIS Bologna, and I was like, if they give me a fellowship, I would go. I think I got in. I don't remember, but I didn't get a fellowship, so I didn't do a second master's. But I call it the Fletcher Mafia, because I think, there's the Georgetown Mafia.
It truly is.
And the Kennedy School, and obviously the Sciences Po, but there's something particular about Fletcher students that, it's a very strong alum network. And they do have a lot of good faculty in peace and conflict and development. So two questions here. For people, I'd say the average age of people engaging in the podcast or community tends to be more 35, but between 25 and 50, sometimes older. So if someone is thinking about grad school, obviously just reflecting back, and you're a professor now, what is your advice? And I think all of us have messy careers. I had coffee with someone yesterday, and she had like a life plan. I've never had a life plan. I just I have a sense, and she's like confused because her life plan is changing. But just for anyone who's thinking about whether to grad school or not grad school, that's one question. And then if they decide on grad school, just any thoughts on how to pick a program or an institution or a location. And particularly for people who want to work in change-making careers, where some paths, some pathways, it's very clear you can get a finance degree, you can work on Wall Street, and then maybe move to an impact investment organization. But if you want to work on human rights, and and I have friends that work for Planned Parenthood, there's a lot of UN Women, UNDP. But it's like, if you want to work in these areas where the work is so important, but the career trajectory is more not so linear, like what's your advice for how to pick if it's worth going to grad school, and then how do you that thing, and then if you do go, particularly if you're not following a more linear career path, which all of us are building portfolio careers now, like how do you decide on the right institution or program? And no place will guarantee you a job, but some places will do a better job in upskilling and networking.
I would say, when I started, this is a while ago, this is over 10, 15 years ago, but you had to have a master's degree to get a job. You either had to have a master's degree, or you had to have lived and worked abroad for 5 years to get some of these entry level kind of program associate level positions. I think that's changing. I think just the nature of work is changing, that people are realizing that, the nature of higher education is changing, and people are realizing that degree or certificate maybe is not the only way to get that valuable knowledge and experience. I think it's changing, but I still think grad school is a good option. It just depends on, again, I have so much debt that I will be paying for a very long time. So you have to be willing to take that on, or find, funded fellowships and scholarships as well. But I took on a lot of debt to go to grad school. But I do think so for some, again, I tried to find work to go that route. I wasn't able to find it. So I decided to go the grad school route. I think it's still a great way and a credential that folks are still very much valuing. So I would say, if grad school feels right for you, definitely look into it. But now, as someone who works at a grad school, works with students, and also reflecting on my own experience, I think it's really valuable or really important to make sure that you know why you're going to grad school. I have my master's degree. I also have a JD, so I went to law school as well. And it's really interesting. In law school, the demographic's a lot younger. And a lot of people honestly went from undergrad to law school because they didn't know what else to do. They didn't know what kind of career they wanted to have, but law school seemed like a great place to try to figure that out. It's too expensive. It's too expensive, and so much time, so much of your valuable time to do that in hopes that maybe you'll have an epiphany. I had a friend who went through law school, which is a really intense experience, only to come out and being like, I never want to be a lawyer, and went back to this. She was an educator. She went back into education. And I think she worked on policies. It's slightly different, but she could have done that transition without going to law school. So, but going back to grad school, I think it's really important that you figure out why you're going to grad school and what you hope to get out of it. I took a 5 to 6 year pause to get work experience, but also because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And so by having some other jobs, by having some more life experience, I was able to kind of hone in on women's reproductive, women's human rights as a place where I found passion and wanted to have that career. Again, it ended up changing. And of course, as Craig said, your career will evolve. But I think it's really important to know what you want to get out of grad school as you pick your programs. I also think that picking a program that a lot of universities, Brandeis, Fletcher, a lot of universities have partnerships with other universities and other programs. So if you want to take some classes at the business school, you can do that. Or if you want to do a joint degree. So there is some flexibility in some of these programs where you're like, well, maybe a business degree would be interesting, but I don't really want to get my MBA, but maybe take a couple classes there, or maybe, for example, at the Heller School where I teach, there is a Peacebuilding. It's a conflict resolution coexistence program. There's a sustainable development program, public health, and an MBA program. And so students that are within the Heller School, you can kind of take classes between programs, which is nice. Same at Fletcher, because there are so many different concentrations. You can kind of focus on the thing you came to do, but also take other classes to see what else might spark your interest, help you think in a different way. I think so. It's important to, number one, know why you're going. And I think the second thing, this comes from my own reflection and experience now working in the sector, doing hiring myself, looking at resumes, in that it's not just about going to grad school and taking classes. Like a lot of my students, they'll send me resumes to review. They have like which classes they took listed on their resume. And I often tell people, it might be controversial, I don't know. I tell them, take that off. Like for me, I don't really care what you learned about in the classroom, because it doesn't always translate into real world like work. Like it doesn't always translate one-to-one. I really care more about your work experience and what skills you have. And so I think when you're thinking about which programs to do, it's also about the name. This is silly, the name of the degree, but because it tells a lot about kind of what you generally learned and what you're specializing in, as well as not just the classes, but the network. As Craig, you mentioned, the Fletcher Mafia is a thing. It's really weird, but if a student writes to me and says, I'm a Fletcher student, I will always write back. I have reached out to Fletcher alum that I don't know, like even now today, like I'll reach out to Fletcher alum to either invite them to come speak on a panel or my own career kind of advancement or informational interviews, whatever. And it works. It's a weird thing, but that network is so powerful. The one thing that my parents could not teach me, but I have learned along the way, is that networking is really how you get a job. It's not the number of resumes that you send out necessarily, but it's really about kind of who is in your network, who you're talking to, what connections you have. And so choosing a school that has a network, right, of folks that are in that field you might want to work in. I'll give you a really concrete example. So I went to BU Law School. Boston University Law School is not known for its international law program. They do have a great program and some great professors, but they're really but the career office was like, who are you? Like, what kind of jobs do you want? Like, we don't do that here. And so they're really coming out of law school and Boston University, there really wasn't a built-in network. Whereas if you went to, for example, Harvard Law, where they have a really robust, international constitutional law program, or other universities, right, you would have that built-in network. I didn't at BU, but I had my Fletcher network, so that I was able to kind of use that. So I think that's really important to understand who the alumni are, where are they working, and how robust that alumni network is. And this is tricky. I don't really know how you find that out, because I'm sure every admissions office will be like, oh yes, we have a very vibrant alumni network. But I guess the best way is just to talk to network, talk to other people and say, where did you go to school and how was your experience? And kind of informational interviews can be a very powerful resource. Again, each person has their own specific experience and it may not translate to your experience, but if you do enough of them, you might get a sense of who is who and what is what. So I would say if grad school is the right path for you, just again, be sure you know what you're going in and want to get out of it. So that way, when you're there, you can really focus on that. Otherwise, you can get caught up in all these interesting classes and clubs and social events. And then the 2 years passes before you know it. So it's really good to come in with a particular direction. Might change, but come in with a particular direction. Make sure the program is well matched to your interests.
Wonderful advice. I have a couple of comments, but just a reminder, so people watching from around the world, if you want to share where you're watching from, let us know, or your questions or comments. So just two things. Obviously, I taught full-time for 10 years and still teach. And I would say it's shocking to me how few people thoroughly investigate both whether grad school is a good decision. And again, it's personal. Like, don't, obviously it's still, the credentials still can help a lot, but obviously weighing, if you're going to, if you can do it fellowship or relatively debt free, then it's often a good decision, in my opinion. But if you're taking on a lot of debt, just make sure you understand both the financial and other cost and benefit. But I'll say, as a professor, because I did a lot with admissions, when someone would come and just ask typical questions, like, it's not that interesting. But I had like one of my favorite alum, he and his wife both went on to medical school. I mean, like they had a career plan. He speaks like 5 languages, worked all over the world, but he basically like interviewed us for like an hour and a half, like really detailed questions. And so one of the things, if you're going to invest the time, like the same way, if you're choosing a city to live in or a job or potentially a life partner or buying a car or whatever, like, some kind of major life decision. I mean, I don't like really investigate what courses they offer. Are the faculty engaged in the world? Do they really do strong field partnership with both community? So it's not just about the classes, it's like the whole thing, and the network and the career services. So a lot of people, you can go to a great school but not have a network. You can go to a good, you can go to a good school and still have there's good schools that are not in the major cities that still have great networks. And so just saying, like, I would highly recommend, because I think people are putting more effort because of the cost, but just really like investigate, not in an annoying sense, but like, is this the right decision? And feel free to ask those challenging questions about placement rates or salaries or what type of career support, or do you get access to the career center forever? Or one, like, some places they'll cut you off after, some places don't have career centers, and other places after 1 year, you're cut off. So it's like, what is not just what are they saying, but what are they doing? And it's still hard because there's no, I haven't seen, Yelp has got lots of problems, but I haven't seen, the net review of grad schools programs that is, it'd be hard to do, but basically, and there's always going to be disgruntled alum. So I wouldn't say, like, if you hear a few disgruntled alum, don't run away scared. But if you talk to enough alum and faculty, do you come away with this sense, like, if one person hates the program, it might not be the right choice, but like, get some varied perspectives. And when I was deciding on a PhD, I got funding from a bunch. I went to a place that offered me no money, so my ego was hurt. But one student I wrote to, and this was an internet email, was still early. He wrote to me, like, he jokes, he's like, I would rob a gas station to go here. Like just, he said it was like that he would, he wasn't a thief, but like the idea, like, it was worth the effort. And I heard that from multiple people, and it also had that reputation. And anyway, so I don't want to go on about grad school, but so can you describe, you've had lots of different positions. So what, let's focus more on the policy advising end than right now the higher education end. So like, what have you done, or what are you actually doing when you think about trying to influence policy and practice, both at the, like, let's say, global level, but also advising and supporting other institutions, whether civil society or governments or funders? Like, what does it actually mean on a daily basis to be working at this intersection of rights, gender, reproductive rights, peace, security? These are huge issues. So how do you actually ground that?
Yeah, so I would say my main area of work is I work as a trainer, facilitator. So a lot of my work is with civil society organizations. Either I might be contracted through the UN or other international organizations or INGOs that are designing programs often, and I work pretty much within women, peace, and security for the most part. It's, again, careers are a little bit different. So I do work on women, peace, and security, some work on countering and preventing violent extremism, and social inclusion, other spaces, governance, whatever. But a lot of my work comes down to working with women, groups of women, often in civil society, sometimes within government or other political positions, community leaders and things like that, to help them. They're often working to work on social cohesion issues, peace building issues within their community. And they are the experts. Like, they know what's happening in their communities. They know what the root causes of conflict are. They know where they want to get to. And my role as an outsider is to come in and to help them really analyze what is the change that they want to bring about, and how can we design program, how can we work together so that to support them in designing programs that reach the impact that they're seeking to change. So I really come in as a thought partner. Really, I'm like a sounding board and a thought partner. I bring in the expertise that over the past decade that I, in running programs and seeing what has worked in some contexts and not others, and working with many different types of leaders and in many different types of conflicts and political situations. So I kind of bring in kind of just the diversity of experience and inputs, and help others to really figure out, okay, I live in a community where there's really a lot of tension and potential violence, right, between Christians and Muslims. And I'm worried about it. I'm worried about my children. I'm worried about my family members and my community. Like, it doesn't need to be this way. I want to be able to work to make more social cohesion, make it a more comfortable place to live. How do we do that? How do I find the right partners? How do I get funding? How do we make this a place where everyone can coexist together and thrive together? And so they come in with the vision and the passion, and I come in kind of with my own knowledge and expertise on different strategies that can be used to get there. So I would say on a day-to-day basis, it's a lot of facilitation and partnership working and helping women leaders kind of work through these sticky issues. So that's kind of, I would say, the bulk of my work is really around that kind of teamwork, facilitation, partnership piece. And then I will occasionally do some research pieces. So I wrote a paper for UN Women a couple of years ago on women's roles in constitution making and how women leaders have participated in constitution making in places in unrest or conflict, and what strategies have worked, what the outcomes have been, and kind of how women leaders can take that research and kind of use it and leverage it in their own processes. So it's a little bit of training, facilitation, partnership, and as well as some research to help kind of provide the evidence base for the work that's happening.
As you know, Catalina, my partner, both in PC and in life, is an expert on gender and peace and many issues. So a couple of questions on what you said. Can you, if there's something you can share, obviously some things might be confidential, but it's kind of an example of a project or something that you played a role in where, like, you could see a change at the community level or policy level, and then also an example, maybe nothing person or location specific, where that maybe it sounded great because you're part of the title of your talk is on resistance, and so obviously I remember studying the second and third waves of democratization. I moved to Hungary, study abroad, and spent 3 years there right after the end of the Cold War. And it was like this age of optimism, and then the war in Yugoslavia, then the genocide in Rwanda, but there was still this like somewhat optimistic that the world was at least progressing and maybe we'd have a peace dividend. And and right now in a lot of parts of the world, it's the age of backlash and extremism on all sides. So it's not just out there, it's everywhere. So just like an example of where, I'm not saying you did this, but you helped or saw this incredible change. And also lots of projects or efforts don't work, or at least take much longer than expected. So anything you feel comfortable sharing.
I think one of the challenges, so right now I'm an independent consultant, which just means that I kind of float from project to project, from organization to organization. Organizations will come and contract me for a particular project or effort, and then I move on. And the challenge of being consultant in that way is I don't get that kind of longer term view. I worked with one group of women for, I guess it was maybe a 2 to 3 year project cycle. That's how long project cycles sometimes are. And then I moved on and wasn't able to really see, and that project was really around women leaders who are working to prevent violent extremism in their own communities. And some of them were working very much at the community level, and others were working more kind of at the national policy level. And again, did a lot of that kind of program. It was kind of program design, but also community building, kind of community of practice, making those connections with women to be able to support each other on this. I mean, because this work is hard. It takes everything out of you. In some cases, it's really dangerous. It's really taking a big risk and putting yourself and your family at risk to be pushing back on some of these existing systems. But that just a long way to say that as a consultant, I don't always get to see kind of, change does not happen in 2 years or 3 years. Often it takes much longer. And so I have not been able to really see kind of that transformation. But what I have been able to see that I appreciate in my work, and I think that's what helps me to keep going, is seeing the personal transformations. One example is just like your community, I work with a wide range of women, from teenagers to women who are working in their retirement. And this is kind of another thing that they'd like to do in their life, after they've had these long careers. And so, but some of the younger women that I work with, it's amazing to see when they go through this process of, they have a passion, they see a problem in their community, and they want to do something to fix it. By working together, and again, by getting exposure to some of these women who have been doing this for a very long time, seeing especially these younger women building up their confidence and their skills, and being able to watch them really kind of come into their own, I think is just an amazing experience. Or even just seeing someone who has an idea and thinks that it might be possible, and then seeing that come to fruition is just incredible. And I think that's, again, what keeps me going. And these are some really challenging contexts. Working in peace and security, I think, is incredibly draining emotionally, cognitively. It if it was easy, there would be no conflict. We would have put ourselves out of a job by now. But this is real kind of life and death stuff. And hearing the stories of what some of my partners have gone through in terms of, their husbands, their family members have been killed or tortured or are missing. And that's really what has drawn them into this work is so hard. And so to be able to see these small, again, it's not always seeing transformational change in a few years, but being able to see these small changes in the women gaining confidence or having these small victories is kind of what helps to keep me going. But again, yeah, I can't think of a specific example of like a larger impact that I could point to off the top of my head.
No problem. So 2 questions. We'll do a big question first, then go to so SIPRI, Stockholm Peace Research Institute, just put out. It's a great place to follow for peace policy. It's one of the oldest independent peace policy think tanks in the world, and they do a lot of interesting research. And they come out each year with the report on defense spending, or war spending. Let's just call it war. And so usually we're about 1.7, 1.8 trillion globally. I think they just said it's the highest ever. I didn't see which year is, probably for 2023. I think 2.2 trillion. So, obviously the global economy is whatever, 85 trillion. But this is something I think about a lot, that so much of the challenges that people face in communities and policy is because of the mismatch of global priorities, and that the amount of money and support for people on the front lines of change is a fraction, official development assistance, whatever, 150 billion. But so it's a fraction of the money that's spent on war and just, let's say, industries destroying the planet. So how do you go about this? Because, and there's also a lot of money. There's always money for war. I mean, obviously bankrupt countries. So just like mentally, or when you're working with partners, I mean, I think about this in Colombia, because there's a lot of assassinations of human rights activists, labor activists, gender activists, indigenous, even though we have a peace process. So just like mentally, how do you, it's like, is it better to go into the system and just try to change how funding is allocated? Or is it just better, like, basically all we can do is piecemeal because of just the system, how it's operating is not putting the interest of communities and people first in many cases? It's like an esoteric question. So not that you have to have an answer, but just how do you deal with that personally? And also, when you're working with people who say, your country or whatever is, arming or supporting a dictatorship or whatever it is, like, just there's a lot of contradictions in this.
It's really a challenge. It's really a challenge. And for me, and in much of my work, I would say thinking about, I actually just can't think, I can't think in those terms. Like, the amount of defense spending is so high, and the amount of money, as you said, that gets allocated to peace. And thinking about women, peace, and security in particular, it's like even smaller amounts of money. I can't even wrap my mind around that when I am doing my work, when I'm working with women kind of in their communities. I feel like we are so narrowed down that kind of has to be let go, because to carry around kind of the broader system it's too heavy. It's too much for me personally to think about. And I kind of just focus on the work in front of me and focus on the partners that I'm working with, and kind of in their context, whatever issues that they're working on, and kind of laser focus in that way, because I find it just, it's too much. There are so many things wrong with the system. I mean, we could have a whole podcast on things that are wrong, not only with kind of the military complex, of funding and where the money goes leads to how people act and where the emphasis is put on. But, there are also so many challenges within the peace building sector that we can also, pick. And, I'm doing a lot of work now around decolonizing aid and thinking about power and privilege and for both myself and the system more broadly. But for me, as a practitioner, as an individual, I really struggle when I start to think about all of these systemic issues and the challenges. I get really lost and I get really bogged down, and it does not help me to do my work. For others, I know I've got friends who love that stuff and they love hearing about it and talking about it. But for me, it's too overwhelming. It makes me lose sight. It feels like what I'm doing is a drop in the bucket, which it's probably a drop in the sea, the work that I'm doing. But at least I feel like I'm helping other people to make some progress. And so that's really what I focus on. Just for me, cognitively, it's like too much. It's too much of a burden to carry or to wrestle with on a day-to-day basis. So I really just focus on the work and focus on the partners that I'm working with.
Yeah. No, I know that was a big question. I don't have any answers, and obviously sitting around thinking all the time is not going to lead to change. But there are some interesting organizations like Oxfam, Fighting Equality and Alliance, that are trying to change things. So more grounded question. So you've talked about facilitation, like in your work currently or in the past 15 years, what skills, obviously it depends on where you're embedded, who you're working with, but what are the skills that you come back to over and over again? And, whether it's facilitation, dialogue, knowing how to manage money, and just anything for people who are in the impact sector or aspiring to work on some issues. Because facilitation, I've had some training, but a lot you just learn by doing. But it's like the catch-22. It's hard to get unless you're a skilled facilitator, it's harder to get people to hire you to be a facilitator. So just any thoughts, like, both I don't want to call them soft skills, but the really critical human skills or systems, and then, any other kind of project management things.
I'm actually going to go back to your last question because I realized I forgot to say something, and then I'll get to skills. It was about, you had asked about like, is it easier to be within the system to try to think about some of these challenges? And I do have to say that I think I've really wrestled with it. I think, again, peace building, international development, international aid is a tough industry to be in. There are a lot of challenges. Again, seeing progress is like so little, especially when it comes to peacemaking and peace building. You know, you think about what's happening in Gaza, you think about what's happening in Ukraine, in Sudan, in many places, and it feels like we are kind of spinning our wheels. Like, what progress are we actually making when there is so much suffering in the world when it comes to conflict? But I think that it's, and I've thought about, maybe it's time for me to leave the sector. Maybe it's just too much. Maybe I'm not it's not supporting any change. But I think that, and I've talked to several people about it, and they're like, no, like, you need to stay in the, obviously we don't want you to burn out, but like, we need people like you to stay in the sector, right, to help change it and steward it in the direction that we want it to go. And so, I think that there are organizations, there are people that are leading these charges to have to affect change in different ways. So, for example, I'm a security fellow with the Truman National Security Project, which is just an amazing network of all types of people working in foreign policy, a lot of veterans, folks working currently in the administration or administrations in the past that are seeking to change U.S. foreign policy and budgeting, to explore, how can we think about humanitarian assistance or defense differently? How can we do foreign policy in a more effective way? What does that look like? What does that mean? But again, like, you can only affect those change or have those conversations if you're in the system, because, and this is where kind of the policy advocacy work that I've done is like, you have to be able to understand, and this kind of segues into the skills question, is you have to understand who holds power, who is influential, who are the decision makers, number one, who influences those decision makers, who actually holds power in this system, and then how does that system work? You have to do that analysis first in order to kind of then build a strategy of how we want to affect that change. And the only way you can understand how all of that works is if you're in it, if you have that experience, if you've seen it, if you understand how it works and you've lived it. And so what's amazing about Truman is that it's just built of so many different people coming from different perspectives that we can kind of build this system and understand how it works in order to affect that change. So I will say that then going on to the question about skills is, I think what I come back to a lot is having those analytical skills to be able to do kind of that mapping and understanding, is that if we want to, and I do this work both with my women civil society partners, whether it's in Syria or South Sudan, Somalia, wherever, is to do this kind of analysis and map making of understanding what is the problem that we're trying to address, what are the root causes, who are the actors in it, because I think that is so important in affecting change, is understanding what is this beast of a thing that we're trying to change. And I think an organization we both work with, CDA, Collaborative Learning, Craig, you serve on the advisory board. I'm an associate there. They've really pioneered systems thinking in peace building. And I think it's so important to understand kind of the broader system, again, to be able to, some of the things we're trying to change, whether it's community peace building at the very local level, or more broader national or international conflicts like Gaza and Israel, we have to understand what these systems are. And so having those analytical skills is something that I come back to quite a bit. But in terms of facilitation, as you said, I was lucky enough when I worked at the Institute for Inclusive Security, was lucky enough to be mentored by two just amazing facilitators who really kind of opened the door to help me understand what makes a good facilitator. And the skills that I drew from there that I continue to try to hone are, one is emotional intelligence. And this is not something that I was born with. I'm I grew up in an immigrant, Asian family, Japanese family, which emotional intelligence is like not a thing that exists in my family. And this is a skill I continue to work on. But you, as a facilitator, you really have to be able to read the room. It's like being a mediator, right? You have to be able to read the room and understand, are people coming with you on this journey as you're talking, or have you lost them? Is there kind of underlying conflict? Because oftentimes I'll facilitate sessions with people who are on opposite sides of a conflict in the same room, right? Who have, again, gone through many difficult, traumatic experiences, and just even being in the same room is hard. So how do you navigate those tensions? So having that kind of emotional intelligence, I think, is really important in terms of facilitation. And of course comes with working globally, of course, comes with that cultural competence, like being able to understand that. And as an American, it's even more important, I think, than ever, is to understand that, different cultures communicate differently. And just, I think, humility above all else is just understanding that, again, when we talk about things like decolonizing aid or shifting power, like, as the quote unquote expert, which I don't understand how I get that title, but as the person in the room that's coming in, standing at the front of the room, does not make me an expert or does not make me the most knowing person in the room. I am really just a partner, a thought partner. I'm someone coming along the journey, and everyone else in the room is leading. And so what comes with that, I think, is both self-awareness and humility, and understanding that I am not here with the answers. I am just here kind of as a tool to help people get to where they need to get. And the last one that I'll say is understanding with that self-awareness is understanding power and privilege. So understanding that when I walk into a room, based on who I am, what I look like, what I sound like, what my title is, what kind of power and privilege am I bringing into the room? How am I speaking? How am I speaking to others? I try to be really intentional and aware of power dynamics within the room. I think this is something that I'm working on. This is something that I will say I have not mastered, but I think it's important to be aware of and understand kind of how you're interacting with people, and what kind of power structures you are perpetuating, and how you might want to change that with your behaviors. It's a lot of self-awareness. It's like as much inward, I think, as outward when you come to facilitation, for me at least, is being aware of how I am influencing the conversations and the power dynamics in the room.
Amazing list. For anyone who, let's say, because facilitation, I mean, I've been trained as a mediator. I'm not certified. I've had some facilitation training, and I've actually done facilitation trainings but for someone who's like, because these are skills that are useful whether you're in retail, corporate sector. So just any advice for, let's say, someone who has some skills but wants to build them more, because favorite books, or, I mean, not that you should endorse a training program, but any place, like, because a lot of it's just by doing, but often you need that mentor or professor or just opportunity to work with others and reflect. So any advice how to start doing that more?
This is such a hard one because, again, just like you said, Craig, like, I have learned these skills like over time and through working with, again, just different facilitators, seeing how they work, like drawing, like, oh, like, I like how that person does that, or I'll ask questions of other facilitators and kind of pick up different things along the road. I myself, I would love to do a facilitation training, but I haven't found one that's like a good fit for me. So I don't have any to endorse. But let me think about kind of how and where you can build these skills. Well, I think, first of all, so facilitation is part of my job. Like, people pay me to do this, but you don't have to do it as a job. Like, you can think of it as, if you're a student, for example, if you're running a student club, if you are, or an event or something, right? There's facilitation happening every day when you're doing event planning. Or if, let's say, you're working in your job and you manage a couple of people. The way that you manage people, the way that you hold your meetings, your one-on-ones, the way that you do maybe performance evaluations for other people as a manager, right? All of this is all practice facilitation and understanding what power you bring in the room, If you're running a staff meeting and you're kind of, as you're up there in front of the room talking to people and you're seeing kind of like what's going on, like, any time I feel like you are facilitating a meeting or working with a group of people, that's all kind of facilitation practice as well. And you can also watch, let's say you work for an organization and you have a staff meeting every week, or, you are attending you're a meeting attendee, watching the people in the front of the room and keeping these things in mind are also, again, ways to do observational, like seeing like, oh, I really like how that person, opens the meeting. Like they really help set the tone. They really make an inviting. I feel like the way this person feels, like runs this meeting, facilitates this meeting, makes it really feel like we can all participate and that all ideas are welcome, as opposed to when this other person facilitates, it's like they just come and they tell us what to do. Right. Those are, again, observational things that you can take and put into your own practice. So I feel like you don't have to be a paid facilitator to do these things. It could just be in your everyday kind of working and living life that you're seeing some of these things happening, or you're leading your own meetings. You can try to kind of bring in these skills.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, you can use them everywhere. I'm addicted to pickleball. I'm not an organizer, but we have pickleball 6 days a week here, and it's funny because there's one group. I won't get into it. The one group where I go and it's like there's the boss, but it works, and then there's like other groups. There's the bosses, but a lot of resistance. It's everywhere. So just a few more questions. We'll start to wrap up. So in your hiring, when you've been hiring people, any recommendations for applicants for openings, not specific to things you've hired for, but in general, like what, if you're comfortable, you don't have to, but to share, like you've got X number of applications. I mean, my general formula is like when a job comes in, if let's say they get 300 applications, 90% are immediately like, recycled or shredded, 10% get a little bit more look, and then it gets down to like 1 or 2% are actually interviewed. But any thoughts, like what makes for a compelling application, or any other thoughts on like the hiring process? Let's say for like a program officer role.
Sure. So I would say I have worked, so before becoming an independent consultant, I worked mainly for smaller NGOs. So we have not had the luxury of using like AI or other recruiters to like go through all of the resumes that we get. So it's often done manually by people like me. And so the process that I've been through with several different organizations is that we do look at most, not all resumes, but most of them. Let's say, for the positions that I have hired for, maybe we're talking about like 100. We're not like some positions get like thousands of applications, like maybe 100 applications or so. Look through most, but the thing is again, this is just at small organizations that don't have dedicated HR departments. So the people that are doing it are the program people. I will often look at the applications that come in first. So the sooner you get it in, the better. As well as the applications that are recommended by other colleagues. Like, oh, hey, Nanako, like this person served as an intern. I think they'd be great for you. Here are their materials. They send me an email. Like I'll look at those and then like the first set. But once you get a good enough group of folks to interview, you find like maybe 5 people that you're like, or even 3 people, like, oh, these people look great, I'm going to interview them. All the rest go into kind of the side bucket. So you want to be kind of in those front lines to get to that process. So I think that those are some things that I think can help people get in. So apply early and use your connections, because I think that those always speak well. I will give a little bit of context in that I'm looking at someone on paper. They look great, but I don't know them very well. I don't know them at all. I met them for half an hour. I met them for half an hour. And so I don't know them at all. I have had experiences where someone looks great on paper. They did great in the interview. They come to work for me, and honestly, they kind of suck. They know how to say all the right words, but their work ethic isn't great. Their work is actually kind of sloppy. Like I have to do a lot of cleanup, but because I didn't know them. But if someone else says, I've worked with this person, they show up on time, they work really hard, they get their deliverables done on time, like all of these things, it's great. They're vetted. I know that they're gonna, they've been vouched for. That's where that value comes in with the networking piece, is that this person is a great worker and a great teammate. Like I would want to hire them. So that's, I think, an advantage of using your network to kind of apply for jobs. And the other thing that I would say in terms of hiring is resumes. So, and I struggle with this myself, and I am not going to pretend. Craig, you are the person to ask in terms of what AI can do for you in terms of your resume. But the thing that I see, because I actually just did a bunch of hiring for a couple internships at Bean at the Boston Network for International Development. And what I'm seeing a lot in resumes are two things. One is resumes are sloppy. People are sending in really sloppy resumes that are hard to read. The font is all different sizes. The spacing between paragraphs is all messed up. So it just makes it really hard to skim. I know that sounds really simple, but I've just been surprised at the number of resumes that come in that are really sloppy and I can't really read them quickly. It makes it difficult for me to get the information that I need. The second thing is, especially for like program positions, folks who may have had really interesting experiences, other jobs. They, were working on designing new programs. They had this impact. They did all these wonderful things. But the way that it's translated into their resume is in a language I can't understand. It either has too much jargon, or because you write that one bullet point that's not a complete sentence, it's like a jumble of words that I can't understand. And this is something I struggle with as well, and maybe Craig will have the answer on how AI can solve this for us, but have someone else read your resume. So my husband works in climate adaptation here in the United States. So very different sector from mine. I have him read my resume and say, does this make sense to you? When you skim this, like, do you pull out like these specific points I'm trying to make? Because his read is going to be very different from mine because I wrote it. So have other people, whether it's, a friend, a professor, a career service person, read your resume to make sure that it's understandable. Again, these things sound really basic, but these are the common mistakes that I'm seeing as I'm going through the hiring process.
I mean, all wonderful advice. And, we look at resume PC on 5 different components. I won't get into too much, but aesthetics is a big part of it. And the way I define aesthetics is it does invite, whether it's a human or an ATS system, does it invite the person or machine to engage and like make them happy? That's apart from the quantification, structure, and all that. And a lot of resumes, they push me away. Like I just saw one yesterday, so, it was like 7.5 font. Like there's just simple things like, so again, in terms of AI, we have a whole course on that. But I think the main thing is you don't use AI to do your whole resume or cover letter. It can be a great assistant and you have to personalize it. So I think Claude is the best tool right now. There's lots of others, but if you upload your resume and the job description and you give a series of prompts, it can be very useful. If you just put it your resume and say like make it better in ChatGPT or any tool, it's not going to be good. But it's like and then you have to do human editing. So but AI is not the solution. It's a tool. So 6 more minutes, then we'll wrap up. So two bigger questions, 2 simple questions. So one is, I've done a lot of consulting work. I've hired lots of consultants, and there's a lot of wonderful, incredible. The people are amazing. There's also a lot of dysfunctional organizations. All organizations have challenges. So any advice, if someone is considering, let's say they either going to be in a bid for a consultancy or they're being interviewed for an actual consultancy, how to vet an organization, not anything specific. I'll just give an example. Like I consulted for a project with a colleague for a year. Just like maybe 20, 30 days. Project itself was good. We had some challenges, but it's like the contractor, just like we were not happy with the contractor, and they were just like a lot of frustration. And then I could have gotten potentially a full-time job with them. And I talked to my network and everyone's like, do not ever work for them full-time. Like I had an interview and I just backed out after that. And then they rebid for another contract and they wanted us to be in it. Both of us said no. Like we just didn't. So it's like, how do you vet either for your emotional sanity or just actual, like if you're going to a community, whether it's in your own country or elsewhere, like where you could be at risk?
I have definitely had some positive and both challenging experiences. In some ways, I think just building off of your example, there's often just no way to know. I, for example, had a project a couple years ago, and overall it went fine. Like, we got the work done, but it was kind of ugly. Like, myself and the person who was running so I was the consultant, writing a gender equity and social inclusion kind of toolkit and training program for this large INGO. But the person that I was working with, so we got connected through another colleague. And so I vetted them through I said, have you worked with this person before? Like, what is it? What are they like? Like, how does it work? And they gave me glowing reviews. So it should have been fine, but I think it was just our working styles. We could not communicate with each other. Like, she would ask for something, and I feel like I'm a good attention to detail person. I take notes. Like, I say, okay, what I hear you saying is you want this, and then I would make it, and she'd be like, that is not at all what I asked for. Like, oh, okay. And we went through this many, many times, and it was just like not a good working relationship. And she did come back and was like, hey, like, we're going to do a 2.0 version, or we're going to launch this training. Like, do you want to come? Do you want to do it? And I was like, no, I'm really busy. Like, I can't do it. But it's, so the lesson I learned there was, like, even when you vet, like, you may not know, maybe that person just had a better personal working experience, communicated differently, or maybe they didn't work that closely with that organization or person. It's just hard to know. I also find, as a consultant, one of the challenges is that it's so temporary. You're coming in for a particular project and then you leave. And so it's so project based, that when I've come into contact with an organization where I see that there are real issues, and sometimes real issues with their program design, like their program design is on social inclusion, but their organizational culture is really exclusive, or really, I don't know what to call it, like kind of based on white supremacy, or like very racist, undertones, or maybe overtones. I've seen it, and you kind of just have to do your best. And everyone's different. I am not a person who will call out an organization just like that. Like, I have worked with organizations where I was like, oh, like, this is not great, I'm just going to do this project and get out. But I do find that I have a couple clients that I have worked with over many years, and there I personally feel more comfortable being able to bring up some of the issues that I'm seeing, whether it's practices, or have we thought about doing this project a little bit differently, or bringing in a different partner, or taking a different approach. Like, I feel like for some of my longer term partners, I feel more comfortable having those conversations. But I have worked with organizations where I'm like, oh, like, this is bad. Like, I just mental note, like, never work with them again, and tell other people not to work with them.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it's mostly networks and word of mouth. There's no glass door.
Exactly.
But again, maybe sometimes I've been, I don't want to say it's always them. Sometimes it could be me, and sometimes it's just the mismatch of styles. But there are really unhealthy places. So last big question, then we'll wrap up with two questions. So decolonizing aid, or decolonizing practice. You started off talking about growing up in Washington State and kind of implicit and explicit bias and experiences. And I mean, obviously we should this is like a PhD thesis or a million books, but any thoughts for people who are, both from your own reflections about how being of Asian background and just being in the system, and also an American, like, how do you engage or start to shape it, both for you and the system? And then just any favorite, I love Decolonizing Wealth Project by Edgar Villanueva, which is really looking at, I think the 2.0 version of the book is out, but it's really looking at philanthropy. And he's Native American, came from, and I think he's, and obviously Peace Direct has done amazing work, but just both reflections, resources, and, any other thoughts about, because there is so much, despite all the talk of localization, whatever that means. I mean, I have a friend, she's been in this industry for 50 years, a very good friend, and, has worked all over the world, from Somalia to Pakistan. And she's like, the discourse changes, the practices don't really. I mean, that's her, not saying like, participate. So just any thoughts, like, both as a practitioner and policymaker and academic, and favorite resources.
Sure, we'll try to, again, this could be a whole podcast.
Yes.
But just on what you just said, related to the discourse changes, but the practices don't. I mean, CDA Collaborative Learning wrote A Time to Listen, which is an amazing resource. I recommend. I teach at Brandeis University in their conflict resolution and coexistence class. I have students read portions of this book that was written over a decade ago. And it's about kind of localization and essentially shifting the power, being more community driven. And that, it's these conversations have happened over and over again. Who knows if this time it will take hold? But what gives me hope is that, and again, I have only been in this sector for 15 years. So I don't know what has come before, but what gives me hope is that we're starting to see institutions change. And by institutions, I mean some of the big bilateral donors in the language that they use and in some of their practices. Again, this might have already happened before my time already, and maybe it came to nothing, but I'm seeing some of that changing in the way that people, in the way that the bilateral funders are thinking and working, as well as really large INGOs. So I feel like, again, we talk about systems change. Those are some really influential actors that if they can start changing their ways of being and doing, it gives me hope that the system might evolve. But it is a challenge. And I think that, again, as I said earlier, thinking about these big systems really is overwhelming for me. So I focus on, what can I do in my small sphere of influence? And that really is being self-reflective in my own practice, in facilitation, but also just in my teaching. I try to imbue this in my courses. I teach a class on program design at Brandeis, and I have a whole class session about understanding who you are, especially if you come from, we call it the global north or Western, whatever, if you come from the US or Europe, understanding, who you are, but again, intersectionality. So perhaps you are American, but you have an immigrant background, or you come from all kinds of different lived experiences, but understanding kind of who you are, what you bring, what power you bring based on how you look, how you speak, what people think of you, just understanding how that presents, to me, is like the little kind of micro changes that we can make, and I can instill in future people who are going to be working in the international aid sector, to be thinking about it, because that's already something new. As part of the Boston Network for International Development, BNID, we run a lot of discussion groups and webinars and things, and we've had a few conversations on issues like, I feel like DEI, DEIJ, DEIA, so many different acronyms, but diversity, equity, inclusion, decolonizing aid, these kind of themes around power and privilege. And I have been surprised at the level of awareness and self-awareness when it comes to some practitioners. Like, people say all the right things about decolonizing aid, but then when they talk about their own practices and they talk about the people they work with, the language that they use is like, what? Wait, like, what just happened? It's very different, right? That there is some kind of implicit bias in there. So that's all to say that I think what I try to do is both be aware of myself and to be able to instill that self-awareness in the students that I work with, and in the partners that I work with through BNIT and others, just to help people think a little bit differently or be more aware of kind of the language they use and how they act. Because I think it makes those little micro things, in addition to the larger institutional changes, will hopefully bring the field in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, and
sorry.
Go ahead.
Last resources, two things that I'll say, or three things maybe. Peace Direct. I love the recent reports that they've been doing on decolonizing aid, and the workshops, or I guess discussion groups they've been having. The Ringo Project, Reimagining INGOs, I think is another great resource. And then Healing Solidarity is something that I came across through my work with CDA. What I like about them is it's very more, it's not just reports, but it's actually like interactive discussion spaces that you can participate in. And they also do workshops with organizations to think about kind of power and equity.
Wonderful. Yes. And yes, CDA is amazing. I'm delighted to be on the advisory board, and I've done some consulting with them. And if people have not looked at their 25-year track record of just, this has been the message, is like not that locals have all the answers, but like development or peace building projects rooted in local contexts are going to be often more sustainable, thrive and have a bigger chance of success. And there's a webinar next week, Stopping a Success Project. So if you haven't looked at CDA, just amazing, incredible, and again, Peace Direct, but it's one of the best resources out there, and it's evidence-based and research-based, but often going out, like the listening project, I forgot how many people and countries they went out and engaged the people who are on the receiving end. So it's really unique. So please check out their work. So last two questions, these are simple, and then we'll end because we're over time. So first of all, just a little bit about what the Boston Network for International Development does, and if people are in Boston or not, like what resource, you already kind of described it, but what are you doing and how people might engage?
So the Boston Network for International Development, which we call BNID for short, is a community of practice of sorts. We do many things, but I think for this audience, the best way to describe it is a community of practice. So we are a network of both INGOs, funders, consulting groups, but organizations, as well as individuals working in international development. We define it broadly because I'm a peace builder, but it's like peace building, international development, human rights, like you name it. It's kind of a community of practice here in Boston. In Boston, it's not really known as kind of a hub of international aid, but there are well over 100 organizations, and then consultants and beyond working here. And so we're really kind of a hub. We hold webinars and workshops and discussion spaces to talk about things like decolonizing aid, but also fundraising. Like, how do I do better individual giving campaigns? We talk about board recruitment. So both kind of professional monitoring and evaluation. We do both professional development as well as organizational development. And that's mainly through our membership program. So if you are based in the Boston area, or maybe New England more broadly, and work in international aid, I highly recommend you look us up. Our membership program is both for individuals as well as organizations, organizations like Oxfam, Partners in Health, really large organizations, as well as small ones that have like a couple people working here and then offices abroad, are members, as well as a range of individuals and students. I highly recommend you look into our membership program if you're based in the area. Our website is bnid.org. And of course, you can reach out if you have any questions.
Okay. And then last question, best channel to stay informed on, being that you can go to the website and follow on social channels or newsletter, but for you personally, is your preferred channel LinkedIn, or just best place to stay informed on what you're doing?
Yeah, best way to stay in touch is through LinkedIn. I'll publish my most latest work and kind of what projects I'm working on and other things through LinkedIn.
Okay, so thank you so much for your energy, wisdom, and engaging in the big picture and medium picture, and all the work that you have done and are doing to make a more just, at least somewhat little more just and equitable and peaceful world. And please, everyone who's listening today or in the future, once this becomes a podcast episode, please follow Nanako on LinkedIn, follow Boston Network International Development, follow Collaborative Development Associate. Because they changed the name, Collaborative Development Associates, PCN, and please consider sharing and rating the podcast. And thank you so much. Sorry we went a little bit over, but it was wonderful. And we're going to stop here.
Great. Thank you so much.
If